Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to cover section 9.1, and it deals with energy and life. But this chapter is about really photosynthesis. How do we get the energy in the food chains and food webs? You know, why are these autotrophs so important? So let's dive in. So today's learning objectives is I'm going to talk about an energy molecule called ATP and how it's useful to cells. And then I'm going to discuss very briefly the definition of photosynthesis. So in science, the definition of energy is the ability to do work. Okay, so if it does work, it's energy is involved in somehow, and it comes in a wide variety of forms. You've covered this in 6th grade science and physical science 9, but there are a lot of different forms of energy, and it can be grouped into kinetic energy or potential energy. So kinetic means energy of movement. So anything that moves, like thermal energy, believe it or not, thermal energy is just the measure of how fast molecules are moving. You work out vigorously, you're moving really, really fast. What happens to your body temperature? It gets a little bit elevated, right? That's thermal energy. You stick metal into a fire and metals expand, right? Talking about my Eiffel Tower fun fact trivia a couple days ago, metals expand. Okay, sorry about that. I just got this weird message. Mechanical energy is the energy of objects in motion. Electrical energy, particles moving through a wire. Magnetic energy, push or pull. So those are all different forms of kinetic energy. But today I'm going to talk about potential energy, specifically chemical energy, how energy is stored in food and fuel, specifically a chemical bond. But other types of potential energy is like elastic energy. It has the potential to do work. You pull back on a rubber band. You haven't released it yet, but once you do, then it turns into kinetic energy. Or a spring. You compress a spring. There's some stored energy there. You let the spring go. That stored energy becomes kinetic energy. But we are going to focus in on chemical energy. So in stored or potential energy, bonds break and atoms are rearranged in some way, and as a result it gives off energy. So the storing of energy in cells takes place in a molecule called ATP. Okay, it is by far the most common energy molecule inside of a cell. ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. So it's made up of 3 things: adenine, ribose, and then these 3 phosphates. This is a short-term energy molecule. It only holds energy for small amounts of time, and then that energy is released, and then your body cells can make more ATP. But where is this energy in ATP? We have to focus in on the phosphate groups. Each of these phosphates actually have a negative charge. And what do you remember with like charges when they come in close proximity with each other? I hope you're thinking they repel or push away from each other. And so this last bond right here between the 3rd and the 2nd phosphate is very unstable. And once that bond is released, energy is given off. But it's also very simple to recreate that bond. So the last phosphate group is unstable due to the like charges. And when it breaks, ATP becomes ADP for adenosine diphosphate, because now there's only 2 phosphates. So once that phosphate is cleaved off, energy is released. Here's my ADP molecule. It has the ability to become ATP, so ATP can be used again. And so your book talks about how ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is like a fully charged battery ready to release energy, and you cleave that bond off. That energy is used to maybe power a vesicle down the microtubule or whatever. And now it has become ADP, and it's a partially charged battery, but it does have the ability to become charged again if you connect that phosphate back on there again. So your body doesn't have a lot of ATP. I think I read somewhere that, your body, like your human body, only has about maybe 50 grams of ATP, and it actually goes through this amount within seconds. So your body is constantly making ATP, turning it into ADP, and then recreating ATP again. So just a diagram showing how ATP, you snap off that phosphate, energy is released, it does work of some kind. Now you have ADP. If you want to make more ATP, you're going to have to use energy. to slap that phosphate back on to turn it into ATP. All right, so how cells use energy. This is just a snapshot of what cells use ATP for, but the big one is active transport, which we discussed in a previous chapter. The movement of molecules from low to high, and you're going against the concentration gradient, so it requires energy. So sodium potassium pumps are involved in neuron signaling and muscle contractions. Second way cells use energy is for movement. Cilia, muscles, flagella, all of those need ATP to be powered and moved. Protein synthesis, which we'll talk about later on in the semester, how do we make proteins inside of our cells. When they respond to chemical signals, ATP is usually involved with that. And finally, ATP can be converted into a different form of energy. And so we'll touch briefly on that later on as well. Okay, switching gears to heterotrophs and autotrophs, because this chapter is about photosynthesis, and photosynthesis is a process by which an organism makes their own food through sunlight. And when an organism can make its own food, we call it an autotroph. And so some examples of autotrophs are plants, algae, and some bacteria. Now, organisms that get energy by consuming other living things are called heterotrophs. They can't make their own food. They have to consume food, or they have to consume another organism for the energy to make ATP. So photosynthesis, we're using sunlight. We're taking sunlight, which is amazing. I mean, electromagnetic radiation, and we are converted it into a chemical energy stored in the bonds of carbohydrates. It's so cool how we take water, carbon dioxide, and sunlight, and we weave it together to make a carbohydrate. Remember that you can trace everything back to the sun, for basically on what you consume. Think about what you had for breakfast, think about what you had for lunch, and you just trace it back, and you know what? The ultimate energy source here is the sun. Autotrophs need ATP as well as heterotrophs, but they make their own food, and it's the food that is broken down that turns into ATP. Okay, so I just talked about why ATP is useful in cells and what happens during the process of photosynthesis. Now, on your assignment, you have a diagram that looks like this, and we kind of struggled with it in class, so I'm going to just touch a little bit on it here. So this is our ATP molecule, and remember that it's made up of three things. So if you looked into your notes, it's made up of an adenine group. You know what? I'm going to type it. It's a lot clearer than me. Whoop. Wow, my laptop is being extremely glitchy here. We are thinking very slowly. Adenine, sorry. It's made up of adenine. So this right here is that nitrogen base adenine. And this right here is my sugar. Wow. Ribose. And each of these are phosphates, right? Because it's triphosphate. I'm going to see if I can just space it over, because it's just super glitchy. Okay. Anytime you see these little explosions right here, that usually represents energy. Energy is being given off. Slide this up. Wow, come on now. Energy. Energy is being released. Every time you cleave off a phosphate, it's being released. Okay, so now we've lost a phosphate. Now what's the name of this structure right here? That is ADP for adenosine diphosphate. Okay. And these two are the same, so go ahead and write adenine and ribose here. And that means energy added, and a phosphate is being added here. So you're going to write added. So that's what the diagram is. So I basically just did the diagram for you. So that does it for section 9.1.